Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in the Missouri Ozarks. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. Autumn of 1908 came early to the Ozarks. The wind sharpened by mid-October, drawing the scent of hickory and iron from the hills. The leaves clung to their branches longer than usual, as if reluctant to turn, reluctant to fall. It was that same month the people of Cedar Hollow Township prepared for their annual harvest service, held each year inside a simple whitewashed church known as St. Matthew's Chapel. Built by hand in 1871 on land, donated by a veteran named Jonas Pruitt. By all accounts, St. Matthew's was a place of humble order, one room, wooden, lit by oil lamps that flickered during hymns. The congregation was small but faithful, 43 families spread across the ridges. The pastor, Reverend Amos Fletcher, kept careful records in his thick brown ledger. Every tithe, every baptism, every funeral. His handwriting was neat, meticulous, and unwavering. That ledger would become the only surviving artifact of what happened there on the last night of October 1908. According to the Taney County Courier, a group of children on their way to the service first saw the glow from across the valley. A soft, steady light, not the leaping orange of a flame, but the dim white of a lantern turned inside out. By the time the adults reached the ridge, the church was gone. Not collapsed, not burned, gone. The ground where it had stood was bare earth, dry and pale under the moon. No embers, no smoke, no char. The surrounding grass was unscorched. Reverend Fletcher's house, only 30 paces away, stood unharmed, and the bell that had hung in the belfry was found, lying in the dust, cool to the touch. At first, people assumed a prank or a mistake, but the ledger survived, resting upright on a pew that should not have existed. Inside it, the last entry reads simply, October 31st, evening service postponed, voices in the rafters. Sheriff Caleb Hoyt opened an inquiry 2 days later. His report lists 27 witnesses and one unexplained detail: the faint scent of lilies in the soil, strong enough to carry for yards. The state inspector from Jefferson City visited within the week and noted no trace of combustion. He described the soil as white as sifted ash, though cool and damp. The county coroner, Dr. Nathan Kerr, wrote to a colleague in Springfield that he had seen the work of fire and flood, but never absence, never erasure. That winter, families stopped meeting on the ridge. They moved services to barns and parlors, leaving the open ground untouched. No one rebuilt, not once in the decades that followed. By spring, grass had grown over the spot, but travelers swore the patch never took color. A pale ring in the earth, widening each year. And in the archives of Taney County, Missouri, one curious note appears in Reverend Fletcher's file, written in a later hand. Former parish site of unknown event, soil samples inconclusive. Residents refer to the place as the ground that remembers. By the second week of November, investigators from Taney County had exhausted their explanations. The official report listed the cause of St. Matthew's disappearance as unknown, with no evidence of natural combustion, structural collapse, or human interference. Sheriff Hoyt, a man rarely given to superstition, told a correspondent from Springfield that it was like waking to find your own home unbuilt. The congregation dispersed for the winter, and Reverend Fletcher relocated temporarily to his brother's farm near Branson. He continued preaching, but was said to pause before evening prayers, listening for sounds no one else could hear. It was never the silence that frightened him, recalled his nephew years later. but the way it seemed to answer. In the spring thaw of 1909, the county sent a surveyor, Henry L. Boone, to inspect the ridge for sinkholes. Boone's notebook, still preserved in the Taney County Historical Record Room, describes finding the foundations intact beneath the soil, boards preserved without rot, though buried. They lifted from the earth like they'd been waiting, he wrote. Yet when he returned 2 weeks later, the cavity had filled itself in. Boone resigned shortly thereafter and took a position in Arkansas. A few locals began referring to the vanished site as the Hollow Church. Some believed lightning had struck and vaporized the wood, though no storm had passed that week. Others blamed phosphorus deposits from the nearby caves, which could, under rare conditions, produce cold flames. But even the geologists who visited in April dismissed that theory. No heat, wrote Dr. Kerr, now working with the State Mineral Board. Whatever happened here left no signature of temperature, only change. By early summer, curiosity gave way to caution. Children were warned to avoid the ridge, though some swore they heard faint hymns when the wind aim from the east. A mail carrier, Jonas Reeve, claimed that on clear nights he saw light flickering along the tree line. Not fire, but a kind of milky glow, like lanterns moving through fog. The Courier published a follow-up article in August, a year after the vanishing church. It noted that the grass growing in the circular patch where St. Matthew's once stood remained colorless, as though dusted with ash or chalk. The county clerk, in his final line, added, "The ledger still lies open on the surviving pew, though no wind should move its pages." That autumn, Reverend Fletcher returned to the site alone. His last recorded sermon, found in his papers after his death, contained a single line that no parishioner recalled him ever speaking before. Not all sanctuaries are built to keep things out. It was this line that later intrigued a young archivist named Mary Ellen Doss, who studied early Ozark folklore. In her margin notes from 1913, she wrote, "This valley hides a silence older than its churches. Records from Taney County show too many blanks where words should be." And so the mystery settled into memory, unproven, unchallenged, yet never forgotten. The ridge became a landmark without a sign, visited only by those who wanted to test how long they could stand in that stillness before they felt it looking back. By 1910, the ridge where St. Matthew's once stood was little more than a superstition marked on hand-drawn maps as the clearing. Local farmers plowed around it, and even the children who once dared each other to cross the pale grass now avoided it entirely. One old woman, Mrs. Willa Darnell, told a newspaper reporter, "The ground hums there, quiet-like but steady. You can feel it through your shoes." That same year, Dr. Nathan Kerr, now serving as coroner for Taney County, returned to the site at the request of state officials. He took 3 samples of soil from the ring where the chapel had vanished and sent them to the Missouri School of Mines in Rolla for analysis. Their findings, dated April 1910, reported a curious anomaly. Trace silica content consistent with vitrification. Organic matter nil. Suggest exposure to high-energy absent combustion. In simpler terms, the earth looked as though it had been flash-heated, but without any fire. Dr. Kerr's letter to the Taney County Board was cautious. "It is my belief," he wrote, "that the phenomenon was not flame but light, an intense illumination of unknown source." He urged that no excavation occur until the ground ceases its stillness. His warning was ignored. A farmer named Benjamin Holler attempted to till the ridge that autumn, claiming that land unused was land wasted. His plow struck something hard beneath the surface. Wood or stone, he wasn't sure, and then refused to move. That night, his oxen broke loose from their pen and were found wandering near the hollow, foam on their mouths, their eyes clouded over as if blind. Holler moved away the next spring. Meanwhile, rumors spread that the church bell, the one found lying in the dust the night of the vanishing, had begun to tarnish in strange patterns. It was stored in the basement of the Taney County courthouse, yet clerks swore it rang faintly on Halloween nights when the wind came down from the hills. A janitor recorded the sound in 1912, describing it as a single tone that fades instead of echoing. The record of that statement still exists in the courthouse archives, written on paper gone brittle with age. By 1913, interest in the event had faded from newspapers, but one local teacher, Mrs. Ida Haver, gathered oral accounts for her students. Her notes describe a chilling consistency among witnesses. Each claimed to have smelled lilies during the night of the disappearance, though the flower did not bloom that late in the season. No fire, she wrote, no ash, only scent. It was that single detail, the fragrance of lilies, that drew a visiting minister from Springfield, Reverend Jonah Peck, to the site later that year. He held a small service at the clearing, reading from Psalm 90, "Thou turnest man to destruction, and sayest, Return, ye children of men." Witnesses said that as he closed the book, the wind stopped, and for one moment the air shimmered faintly, not bright, but dim and silvery, like moonlight trapped beneath the soil. The Reverend left Taney County the next morning without a word. His sermon book was later found left open on the pew that still stood alone in that field. By the summer of 1914, the incident had been quietly filed away in Taney County's ledgers under unexplained event. Most residents preferred it that way. The Ozarks had their share of strange stories, but this one was different. Not a haunting, not a crime, simply a gap in the world where something should have been. Still, curiosity never dies entirely. That July, two men from Jefferson City, a state geologist named Edward Milson and his assistant Frank Braddock, arrived to conduct a follow-up study. They camped near the ridge for a week, measuring soil density, magnetism, and atmospheric readings. Braddock's journal survives in part, found years later among unclaimed county papers. On the third day he wrote, "Instruments unreliable. Compass needle turns slow, as if reluctant. The ground is cool even in full sun." By the sixth day, his notes grew stranger. Heard faint singing after dark. Dr. Milson insists it's wind in the oaks, but I know hymns when I hear them. The two men left abruptly after that night. Milson filed no formal report, but Braddock sent a personal letter to the Springfield Republican, claiming they had witnessed a luminous fog rising from the earth, without source, without flame. The paper never printed the letter, yet a carbon copy remains in its archive. That same autumn, a fire broke out in the courthouse cellar where the old church bell had been stored. The blaze was contained before reaching the records, but the bell itself was found split clean down the middle, not melted, just cleaved, as if by some immense pressure. Witnesses said the crack gave off a faint tone when the air cooled that evening, long and hollow like a sigh. Dr. Kerr, aging and half-blind by then, wrote his final correspondence to the state. "We are dealing with a silence that behaves like heat." After that line, he never wrote again. He died that winter, report, Edley still asking to be buried on the hill by the church that isn't there. By 1915, the county built a new road bypassing the area altogether. The clearing became harder to find, swallowed by sumac and pine. A few hunters still stumbled across it, a circle where the grass lay flat and pale, never wet with dew. They said the ground felt smooth, almost polished, and that their lanterns dimmed as if the air itself was swallowing light. In 1916, a deputy sheriff named Albert Fry led a short-lived investigation into missing livestock in the area. He found the remains of several animals near the clearing, untouched by scavengers, no signs of rot or smell. His official report concluded only, preserved, not burned, as if arrested between moments. The following spring, Reverend Fletcher's gravestone in Branson was found cracked across the inscription. Locals called it coincidence, but those who had known him best said the break ran straight through the date, October 31st, 1908, as though the stone itself refused to keep the memory whole. And in the Taney County courthouse, beneath the locked drawers of old property deeds, there remains an unsigned note written in an archivist's hurried hand. When the wind comes from the ridge, close the windows. The smell will wake the ground. By the early 1920s, the Ozarks had begun to change. The railroad brought visitors to Branson and Hollister, and the stories that once defined Taney County's hollows started to sound like folk tales to outsiders. Yet among the older families, St. Matthew's disappearance was never treated as a story. It was treated as a warning. A new county clerk, Mr. Hollis Dean, tried to organize the archives in 1921 and came across the old case files. He noted in his logbook that many pages were missing from the 1908 incident folder, replaced by blank sheets that felt waxy to the touch. The ink from other documents stored beside them had bled faintly into those blanks, as though absorbed, but the paper itself remained clean. Dean sent the pages to Jefferson City for testing. They were lost in transit. That same year, local newspapers reported an unusual event. A brief flash of light seen over the hills on October 31st, exactly 13 years to the night after St. Matthew's vanished. Witnesses described it as a pale flame shaped like a tower. One farmer claimed he saw figures moving within it, as though the church was standing again, just for a breath. The Taney County Times printed a small column calling it a trick of fog and moonlight, though those who lived nearest the ridge swore there was no fog that night. The following morning, Reverend Fletcher's old ledger, the one preserved for years on that surviving pew, was found open again, though it had been sealed in a glass case inside the courthouse. On the fresh page, in faint graphite, someone had written a single phrase, "We're still waiting for the hymn." Dean dismissed it as vandalism until he noticed that the handwriting matched the late Reverend's earlier entries exactly. Same slant, same pressure, same looping S. In 1923, the county considered relocating the remaining records to a new facility. When workers opened the courthouse cellar, they discovered that the stone floor beneath the old bell was strangely discolored, bleached white in a perfect circle. The mason overseeing repairs described the stone as powdered smooth, like glass that forgot how to shine. He left the job unfinished. By then, most locals refused to speak of the church at all. It had become what they called the place where the amen stopped. Children learned to whisper it like a game. Say amen twice, or it won't let go. The phrase drifted through the hills for decades, detached from memory, an echo of a prayer no one remembered starting. The few who ventured up the ridge in those years, trappers, travelers, and a few curious students from Springfield, often returned with reports of strange lights and low vibration underfoot, as if the ground itself were humming. One student, Lydia Crane, described it vividly in a letter home. "It's like the air remembers sound, but can't repeat it right." When Crane's letter was postmarked, it bore the date October 31st, 1924. She was never seen again. By the time 1925 arrived, the site of the vanished church was overgrown with cedar and thorn bush. Only a few locals knew how to find it anymore, following faint animal paths, and the memory of where hymns once carried through the valley. Among those who did return was Deputy Albert Fry, now retired, who had led the livestock investigation nearly a decade before. Fry's diary for that spring contains several cryptic entries. One reads, "The clearing grows smaller each year, yet the silence larger." Another, "Soil glows faint in moonlight, not phosphor, something beneath." His last entry, dated April 14, 1925, simply says, "Bell ringing again." That same week, residents of nearby Kirbyville reported hearing a low tone rolling through the night air. Not loud, but deep enough to shake windows. The next morning, a pale mist lay across the ridge, visible even after sunrise. A farmer passing through claimed he saw a roof made of light forming in the fog, vanishing as quickly as it appeared. The Taney County Sheriff's Office filed no new report. The old case had become an embarrassment, an inherited wound the new officials wished to ignore. Yet privately, Sheriff Merritt Lowe, who replaced Hoyt years earlier, wrote to the county board, "Citizens restless. Old talk of the hollow church returning. Sound carries miles. I will not send men up there again." Meanwhile, a geology professor from Springfield, Dr. Marion Hargrove, requested permission to study the site after reading about it in an old 1909 soil bulletin. His student, Eldon Pierce, accompanied him and kept notes throughout the summer. Those notebooks now rest in the Missouri State University archives. On June 5th, Pierce wrote, "Ground magnetic field measurable, slight pulsing in cycles, Dr. Hargrove uneasy, claims compass needle wavers like heartbeat." 2 weeks later, a different tone creeps into his notes. "Nigibay, it visit. Air bright with dust motes though lantern out. Smelled lilies again." The final entry in Pierce's notebook is a single line, written in shaky hand. "We stood where the pulpit should be, and something answered back." Neither man returned to Springfield. Their tent was found collapsed beside the clearing, the earth beneath it white and smooth. Hargrove's watch had stopped at 12:03 a.m. The exact hour locals said the church had vanished 17 years before. After that, no one in Taney County spoke of sending researchers. The ridge was left alone, marked on newer maps only as restricted property. Old residents continued to warn travelers not to cross the line of pale stones at the edge of the forest. A letter preserved in the county clerk's private folder, dated 1926, ends with an unsettling note. "The sound still travels on certain nights. It's not thunder, and it's not bells. It's waiting for an answer." And by the following autumn, the faint scent of lilies returned again, drifting through the valleys during the harvest season, precisely on Halloween night. By 1927, most of Taney County had resigned itself to the legend. St. Matthew's was now more memory than mystery, an empty place older than the people who feared it. The younger generation, skeptical of ghost stories, began venturing into the woods to prove it was nothing more than rumor. But the few who did never stayed long. One account survives from that summer, written by Ruthie Nolan, a school teacher from Branson. In her journal, she described how 3 of her students, boys of 16 or 17, hiked to the ridge on a dare. They returned before nightfall, pale and shaking. One, Will Dent, told her they found the clearing, but that the air inside didn't move. He said the insects stopped buzzing the moment they stepped across the circle. The other 2 refused to speak about what they'd seen. By winter, all 3 had left the county without saying goodbye. That same year, the county hired surveyors to assess new farmland boundaries. Their report mentions a curious detail buried among routine measurements. Section B, Lot 14, soil hard as limestone, pale coloration, repels moisture. Local lore, site of vanished church. The document bears the Taney County seal and the initials of the supervising surveyor, C.H. Moreland. On the back, in pencil, someone later wrote, "Do not dig." In late October, Reverend Fletcher's old ledger once again became a point of interest. The courthouse custodian, Mrs. Emma Foy, discovered it lying open to a blank page. This time there was writing. Not pencil, not ink, but faint impressions pressed into the paper fibers. When dusted lightly with charcoal, they formed words. Still no smoke, still no ashes. The clerk sealed the ledger and moved it to a locked cabinet. Weeks later, the cabinet itself warped, wood swelling inward as though pulled by unseen damp. The ledger was never recovered. By 1928, the story of the Halloween fire that left no fire spread beyond Missouri. A traveling lecturer from St. Louis, Professor Henry Wald, included it in a series titled Anomalies of the Ozarks. Wald proposed that the disappearance might be related to rare electrical phenomena observed across Taney County in the late 1800s, when strange nocturnal lights were reported over the White River during heavy humidity. He argued that St. Matthew's could have been struck by what he called ball lightning of extraordinary magnitude. But locals shook their heads. No thunder that night, they'd insist. No rain either, just singing. One aging witness, Sarah Kerr, daughter of the late coroner, told the Courier in 1929 that her father had never believed it was lightning. He said the earth itself shone that night, she recalled. He said it was a kind of remembering. In her account, she also mentioned something overlooked in the official files, that Reverend Fletcher's shoes were found half buried in the soil days after the church vanished, soles facing upward, clean and unscorched. When asked what that might mean, she paused, then said softly, "He didn't run. He just walked into whatever was coming." And after that, the story quieted again, not forgotten, only waiting beneath the hills, as all old things do in Taney County. By 1930, the hollow was spoken of only in passing, a tale folded into the Ozarks folklore alongside phantom lights and lost silver mines. But for those who lived within earshot of the ridge, the silence had a weight to it, a pressure that seemed to settle deeper every year. A new minister arrived that spring from Springfield, Reverend Joel Merton, a man with more confidence than caution. He declared the story of the vanished church a rural fancy born of poor record-keeping and mass hysteria. Determined to prove his point, he announced he would hold an open-air sermon at the clearing on the anniversary of the disappearance. The service took place on October 31, 1930. Witnesses recall that more than 50 people gathered beneath a cold, clear sky. Lanterns ringed the pale grass, and Reverend Merton's voice carried sharply in the still air. He preached from the book of Job, warning against the sin of fear, and declaring that no land is cursed but by neglect. The congregation sang one hymn, Rock of Ages, before a sudden gust of wind extinguished half the lanterns. Merton paused, joking that the devil dislikes good harmony. The crowd laughed nervously. Then came the sound, not wind, not thunder, but a slow, deep resonance rising from beneath the earth. Witnesses described it as a bell tone stretched too long, a vibration felt in the chest more than heard in the ear. The soil under their feet trembled slightly, yet not a leaf stirred on the trees. Then, without warning, every lantern flared white. When the light dimmed, the crowd found themselves standing in total darkness. The lantern glass remained cool, the wicks unburned. Merton was gone. His Bible lay open on the ground, its pages untouched by soot or ash. The sheriff's men searched the woods through the night, and found nothing. The following morning, the pale ring of soil had expanded by several feet. Where Merton had stood, the earth was smooth and firm, as if pressed by the weight of something heavy that had never been there. The Taney County Courier printed a restrained headline, "Minister Missing After Sermon at Former Church Site." It made small mention of the light and the sound, quoting only that local conditions may have caused atmospheric reflection. But an internal note found later among the editor's papers paints a different picture. All photographs exposed to white glare, negatives clear, no trace of the preacher or crowd. Within weeks, the site was once again abandoned. Some said Merton's voice could still be heard faintly in the wind, others that he joined whatever presence had taken the church. The county erected no marker, no memorial. In the courthouse archives of Taney County, Missouri, a single entry dated November 12, 1930, records the event in understated bureaucratic tone. No body recovered, no evidence of foul play, cause undetermined. After that, the case was never reopened. But from that autumn onward, whenever the October wind turned cold and the mist clung low across the valleys, locals swore they could hear a faint bell ringing in the distance, one long note that never quite faded. Winter came early in 1931, and the ridge fell under snow so thick that even deer tracks vanished by morning. The place where St. Matthew's had once stood, now little more than a pale scar on the landscape, lay buried in silence. For a time, even the stories quieted, smothered by distance and frost. But the following spring, county surveyors again marked the ridge while expanding roadwork near the White River. One of them, Thomas Van, filed a note in his field log on April 17th. Clearing found, circular, roughly 40 feet across, soil texture unlike anything in surrounding area, smooth, compacted, yet no gravel. Metal instruments left overnight show faint tarnish. He also added something that his superior later crossed out in red pencil, sound present when struck with pickaxe, not hollow, but echoing. When the Taney County office reviewed his findings, Van's report was missing. He left the service the next month and moved north to Iowa. In June, a local farm girl named Nora Duval vanished on her way to the creek near the ridge. Her footprints led to the edge of the clearing, then stopped. Searchers found her shoes placed neatly together beside a wildflower bouquet. When the sheriff asked the Duval family if she'd been known to visit the old church site, her mother reportedly fainted before answering. The Courier ran a single paragraph on the disappearance, no mention of the location. But those who read between the lines saw the connection immediately. Another Halloween, another name to add to the whispering list. That summer, a letter arrived at the office of Dr. Walter Klein, professor of physics at the University of Missouri, from an anonymous sender in Branson. It contained a map of the region and a short message: "Study the anomaly before it closes again. Frequency below hearing, light without heat. Find where it breathes." Klein never acted on it, but the letter remained in his private collection until his death. He once remarked to a colleague that the story spoke of a silence shaped by rhythm, not absence. By 1933, the country was deep in depression, and people stopped chasing mysteries they couldn't eat. Yet one Works Progress Administration team, tasked with clearing brush near the ridge, kept strange notes in their daily logs. Foreman Louis McAteer wrote, "No birds, chains dull fast. Crew says ground hums when struck." Another entry adds, "Lunch pails vibrated today, gentle, like music you can't hear." The project ended abruptly after a cave-in took one man's life. His companions said the ground simply opened, though no fissure remained when rescue crews arrived. The official cause was listed as soil instability. The body, when recovered, showed no wounds, no dirt in the lungs, no sign of suffocation. Just eyes open and unclouded, as though preserved. After that, no further work crews were sent to that part of Taney County. The clearing was fenced off and left to the elements. By the time the next decade arrived, maps omitted the area altogether, as if omission could erase what silence had already claimed. Yet old residents whispered that on clear nights, when the moon rose thin and silver, the ridge still glowed faintly, not from flame, but from memory. By the mid-1930s, the hollow had become a ghost on the map, referenced only in rumor and in the margins of surveyor notebooks. Taney County officials stopped fielding inquiries altogether, claiming that the ground is closed. But that phrase, closed ground, took on a life of its own among the locals, a quiet warning passed down like scripture. That year, a federal inspector named James Forrester visited to assess rural lands for reforestation projects under the New Deal. His official report to the Department of Agriculture makes only passing mention of the site. Section 22, unsuitable for planting, mineral composition unknown, elevation low, and acoustically active. But his private journal, found after his death in 1941, tells more. He described the ridge as a perfect circle of ash-colored earth, and noted that when he spoke aloud, his echo came back altered, deeper, almost like another voice. Forrester also reported finding fragments of warped iron in the soil, thin sheets folded like petals. He believed they might have been pieces of the vanished church's bell tower, though they showed no sign of rust or burn. He mailed a sample to the state office in Jefferson City. The envelope arrived empty. Meanwhile, a new local paper, the Branson Sentinel, ran an article titled "The Halloween Fire That Left No Ashes." It revisited eyewitness accounts from 1908, quoting descendants who still lived nearby. One, Clara Hoyt, granddaughter of the original sheriff, said her grandfather would wake every October in his final years muttering the same phrase, "It didn't burn, it forgot itself." Others remembered how he refused to walk the ridge after sunset, saying the ground there knew too much. In 1937, a teacher from Springfield College, Professor Edwin Hasker, brought a group of students to study soil acoustics, an unusual topic inspired by the persistent tales. Hasker's field noted as record-low vibrations detectable by early portable seismographs. "Resonance irregular," he wrote. "Pattern resembles pulse, repeating in approximate intervals of 40 seconds. On their third night at camp, one student, Martha Young, woke screaming. She told her classmates she'd heard a bell tolling softly through the ground. When she placed her hand on the soil, it felt warm, as though a furnace beat below. The next morning, the equipment was dead, no mechanical failure, just drained batteries. Hasker abandoned the project and later wrote an unpublished paper titled "Resonant Ground Phenomena of Southern Missouri." In it, he referenced the Taney County event directly, comparing it to reports of subsonic vibrations observed after the New Madrid earthquakes of the previous century. His conclusion reads, "If energy can preserve sound, perhaps it can preserve structure as well." The paper was quietly shelved, deemed speculative. But those who read the drafts said his description of the site felt more like confession than science. That same Halloween, residents of Branson claimed to see a dim light over the hills again, one that flickered once, then sank slowly into the dark, like a lantern lowered beneath water. No one went to check. By 1938, the hollow was a place only the oldest farmers would mention, and even then only after a few whiskeys. They said the ridge had stopped growing things altogether. No grass, no weeds, not even moss. The soil stayed pale and smooth, untouched by rain or seed. Some called it God's erasure. Others whispered that it was a door that forgot to close. In early spring of that year, Dr. Hasker, the same professor who had studied the resonance 2 years earlier, returned alone. His letters to a colleague at Springfield College survive. 2 pages written in a cramped, uneven script. "The ground hums again," he noted. "Not loud, lower than the ear can catch, but steady. I think it is calling itself back." He was last seen buying lamp oil at a general store in Forsyth. A week later, his horse was found wandering near the old road, reins dragging in the mud. The saddlebag contained his compass and notebook, both coated in a fine layer of white dust. The sheriff's men searched the ridge, but found nothing except an indentation in the soil, shaped roughly like a footprint, deep but perfectly outlined, as if pressed into clay from beneath rather than above. That summer, a thunderstorm rolled across Taney County. Lightning struck an elm tree near the clearing and set it ablaze. But witnesses said the fire burned downward instead of upward, disappearing into the ground. When the storm passed, the tree stood untouched, its bark cool, its roots blackened inside the soil. An old road worker, Elmer Pitt, told a passing journalist, "It ain't that fire won't catch, it's that the ground don't let go of what it takes." His words were never printed, but the reporter's notebook survived. In its margins she wrote, "Standing there feels like hearing someone breathe under your feet." Later that autumn, a new entry appeared in the Taney County Registry of Unusual Events. The handwriting is faint, almost erased by time, but the wording is clear. Subject, unverified lights above Section 22. Description, low, wavering illumination. Source, none. The same page lists the 1908 and 1930 incidents side by side, annotated with the note, "All recorded on October 31st. By then, the pattern had grown impossible to ignore. Every 13 years, something stirred on that date, never violent, but undeniable. 1908, 1921, 1934. Each marked by the same still light, the same faint sound beneath the ground, and always the scent of lilies drifting through the autumn air. The few who noticed the cycle chose not to speak. Those who did said the county didn't want the attention, not after losing so many to curiosity. The official line was that the ridge was private property, condemned for safety, but even decades later, maps showed nothing, just the blank space where it should have been. And though the road shifted, the mail routes changed, and new towns rose nearby, the old families of Taney County swore that every Halloween night, at the stroke of midnight, their clocks would hesitate, just for a breath, as if the hour itself refused to pass. In 1939, the country looked toward the war gathering overseas, and few in the Ozarks had time for ghost stories. Yet that Halloween, for reasons no one could later explain, a small group of townsfolk gathered at the ridge again. Most were young, sons of farmers and miners, carrying lanterns, whiskey, and bravado. They meant to prove the place was nothing but an old superstition. Their ringleader, Eli Crane, was a mechanic from Hollister. He told the courier beforehand, half joking, "If I don't burn, I'll rebuild that church myself." They arrived at dusk. One of the boys, Paul Henders, kept a notebook for the adventure. His entries are now part of the Taney County archives, recovered decades later from a rusted tobacco tin. The first few lines are careless, even mocking. So far, just bugs and bad whiskey. Ground looks like chalk. But the handwriting trembles near the end of the page. The crickets stopped. Eli says he feels the ground breathing. Lantern light looks wrong, shadows sharper than they should be. That was the last entry. By morning, the others staggered back to town, mud to their knees, too shaken to speak. Sheriff Lowe found them huddled outside the general store before dawn. When questioned, each gave a different account, that they'd heard bells underground, that a mist rose from the center of the clearing, that Crane had walked into it and wasn't there anymore. No one mentioned fire. At the ridge, investigators found only 6 sets of footprints. Eli's tracks stopped in the middle of the pale circle. There were no signs of struggle, no drag marks, no ash. His lantern sat upright beside the imprint, its wick cold, its oil unspent. The sheriff wrote in his final report, "Man missing under unknown circumstances. Area consistent with prior 1908 and 1930 incidents. Soil cool to touch. No evidence of combustion or displacement." He closed the FIs, but with one additional remark. Witnesses report scent of lilies, carried by wind from east. After Crane's disappearance, Taney County fenced off the ridge with barbed wire, though locals said the fence posts rotted faster there than anywhere else. The State Forestry Board marked the region unsuitable for habitation. Within a year, the Depression's hardships deepened, and the ridge faded again into the background of harder realities. Families left for work in St. Louis or Kansas City, and the hollow slipped from common speech. But a handful of letters from that time suggest it never stopped humming. A school teacher in Forsyth wrote to her sister, "Every year, the wind carries the same tone, low and long, like something calling through the ground. Children cry without knowing why." In the courthouse basement, the clerk who handled Crane's case found an old scrap of Reverend Fletcher's handwriting tucked between folders. The ink was faded but legible. "When the light comes without heat, kneel. The Lord will not answer twice." He left it unsigned. By the 1940s, few still remembered who the Reverend was, but each Halloween, even when war blackened headlines and hope ran thin, the people of Taney County locked their doors before midnight, not out of fear, but respect. Because some absences still count the living. By 1940, the Second World War had drawn nearly every young man from Taney County overseas, and the ridge slept through a quieter kind of fear. No one went near the old clearing, though the road passing a mile south of it still carried whispers. Truck drivers claimed their headlights dimmed when climbing that stretch, and one man swore his engine coughed like it was breathing someone else's air. That autumn, a federal cartographer named Dr. Roscoe Wills was assigned to remap rural topography for new defense infrastructure. His Taney County field notes record a single cryptic remark: "Depression in terrain, unmarked by vegetation or erosion. Locals advise avoidance. Surface vibration noted at intervals of 42 seconds. Wills drew a small circle beside the words "former chapel site" and shaded it lightly in gray. His report was never published. When colleagues requested his drafts, they found the section concerning the ridge cut neatly from his ledger with a razor. The same year, a letter arrived at the courthouse addressed only to Clerk Taney County. It bore no return address, written in tidy cursive. "You have measured the land too often. Leave it uncounted, or it will measure you instead." The clerk, Mrs. Dorothea Lang, kept the letter locked in her desk. Decades later, her granddaughter recalled how, every Halloween night, Dorothea would sit up past midnight in her chair, eyes fixed toward the hills. When asked why, she'd whisper, "I'm listening for the bell that never finished ringing." In 1941, the war reached deeper into Missouri life, and with rationing came a strange peace. Fewer travelers crossed the Ozarks. Fewer stories moved from town to town. Still, a handful of soldiers returning home on leave wrote about the ridge in passing letters. One, Private Ellis Rourke, described stopping there on his way back from Springfield. "Fog so thick it looked like stone," he wrote. "The ground hummed like an engine under my boots." Rourke shipped out 2 weeks later and was never heard from again. Meanwhile, at the local library, the old file on St. Matthew's Chapel was moved to the restricted section for preservation. Inside was a folded scrap of Reverend Fletcher's ledger, the one believed lost after the courthouse fire decades earlier. In faint handwriting, it carried one last note beneath his October 31st entry. "The light took form tonight. No smoke, no ashes. It stood where I could not. That fragment was signed only with his initials. By the end of that decade, new officials redrew the Taney County district boundaries, and the ridge officially ceased to exist as a named location. The land was marked private, unfit for survey. Even so, the few who inherited nearby property continued to find signs. An occasional hollow note in the soil, a faint ringing on windless nights, and once a perfect outline of a door pressed into the grass. The Ozarks were growing modern by then. Roads widened, radios filled the air, and electricity reached the valleys. Yet just south of Forsyth, one patch of ground still refused the future, and whenever the church bells rang on Sunday, a second, softer tone answered from somewhere under the earth. By the mid-1940s, Taney County was changing faster than anyone could recall. Power lines reached even the back valleys, the hum of generators filling spaces once ruled by cicadas. But at the ridge where St. Matthew's had vanished, there was no progress, no sound of industry, only the same stillness, as if time itself skirted the clearing. In 1944, a group of engineers from the Rural Electrification Administration visited the region to test new line routes. Their supervisor, Charles Niven, kept detailed notes of voltage readings across the hills. On October 30th, he marked one site unstable magnetic interference. His assistant, Pauline Greer, added beneath it, feels like standing above a motor, soil hums when touched. They returned the next evening to record another set of readings. The weather was clear, the stars sharp in the cold sky. The generator truck idled on the road while Niven and Greer set their probes into the dirt. According to the driver's later testimony, both lanterns went out at once, though no wind had stirred. He shouted for them, but there was no answer. Only a single, low vibration rising through the ground that made the engines sputter and die. When daylight came, the equipment was still there, the wires tangled, and the probes fused at their ends like melted glass. Of Niven and Greer, there was no trace. The company filed no public report. Instead, an internal memo quietly transferred the case to state jurisdiction. A single line at the bottom reads, "Investigation halted due to jurisdictional confusion. Property lies in unsurveyed section, former church ground, Taney County." Later that same year, an old resident, Mrs. May Holler, claimed she saw a light in the trees, square like a window. When she approached, she said, it shimmered and then went dark. She told her son that she could still smell oil and lilies, a scent she remembered from sea, Hildhood, when her parents spoke of the vanished church. Meanwhile, a St. Louis journalist, Howard Dane, who'd been writing a series on Missouri's lost towns, took interest in the ridge after hearing Holler's story. His article never saw print, but his draft survives in microfilm. Locals deny there was ever a fire, but what remains feels like a footprint, not of flame, but of memory. The earth rings hollow here, as if struck once and still echoing. After submitting his draft, Dane left for another assignment. Months later, his wife received a letter postmarked from Forsyth. Inside was only a scrap torn from his notebook with 5 words written in his hand. Still no smoke, still waiting. When asked about it, the postmaster admitted he couldn't recall who'd handed the envelope over. From that Halloween forward, the ridge once more became forbidden ground. Hunters found their dogs refusing to cross the line of pale grass. The county sheriff ordered warning signs nailed to the trees, though each one vanished within weeks, leaving only rusted nails embedded in the bark. And as another year passed, the sound returned, a soft, resonant hum that rolled through the valley on still nights, heard best when the moon was thin and cold. No one followed it anymore. Even the mountains seemed to have learned caution. By the spring of 1945, war news filled every radio in Missouri, and few had the patience for old legends. Yet the ridge near Forsyth refused to fade from memory. People still avoided it, even when progress demanded they map and measure every acre. The Taney County Register carried a small note in May. Proposed roadwork north of county line postponed indefinitely. Geological instability reported near former parish site. Unstable ground. That phrase had appeared in county documents since the 1910s, but no one could ever define it. In late summer, an amateur historian named Ethel Crandall decided to investigate the so-called church that burned without fire. She had heard the story as a child and believed it a case of mass exaggeration. With a borrowed camera and a journal, she set out to find the clearing. Her last letter to a friend, dated October 29, 1945, reads, "The locals are kind but nervous. They still speak of lilies blooming in frost. One man says the bell still rings, though no church has stood here for 37 years. I'll see for myself." She never returned. A search party discovered her camp intact. Lanterns cold, blankets folded, camera resting beside her notes. The first few pages describe the hike, the sound of crickets, the feeling of entering the forest. But the final entry is jagged, almost scratched into the paper. The air moved, but nothing else. There is light beneath the soil. The negatives in her camera were overexposed, pure white from edge to edge. Later that year, the courthouse clerk recorded her disappearance with an asterisk beside the line. Last seen near Section 22, unsurveyed, possible sinkhole. But the sheriff's confidential memo, still preserved in the Taney County archive, adds another detail. Soil undisturbed, ground cool, one footprint visible, direction uncertain. That winter, a traveling preacher named Reverend and Clay Hinton arrived from Kansas, claiming to have felt called to rebuild the Lord's house upon the missing foundation. Locals pleaded with him not to go, but he insisted, quoting Isaiah, "The ruins shall be raised." On October 31, 1946, he and two helpers began clearing brush at the ridge. At dusk, a hunter in the hills saw their lanterns shining faintly, then fade one by one, swallowed by a soft, colorless glow. By morning, the brush pile was gone, the tools left standing upright in the dirt as though set there deliberately. No bodies were found, only a faint scorch mark shaped like an open doorway. The incident never made the newspapers. The country was weary of loss. But among Taney County's elders, a new saying took root: "You can't rebuild what remembers." By 1947, the ridge was unmarked again, its paths erased by winter growth. The government closed the surrounding acreage for reforestation, fencing it off under federal claim. Officially, it was to prevent erosion. Unofficially, no one wanted to see the ground breathe again. And so, another generation passed, leaving the silence undisturbed. But some evenings, when wind swept from the east across Forsyth, people said you could still hear faint voices carried through the air, not crying, not praying, but singing softly, as though finishing a hymn that had waited nearly 40 years to end. By 1948, the ridge had become government property, officially designated part of a soil reclamation zone under federal forestry control. Fences and warning signs ringed the area, but locals claimed they never lasted long. The boards would fall overnight, nails pulled clean from the posts. It was as though the ground itself rejected reminders. That autumn, a forestry ranger named Robert Teal was assigned to inspect the restricted parcel. His logbook, preserved in the Taney County Historical Collection, begins with a practical tone: measurements of rainfall, tree density, mineral presence. But on the 5th page, his handwriting shifts. "Section quiet," he wrote. "No birds, no insects. Smell of damp wood and something sweet, maybe lilies." The next day's entry: "Strange hum beneath the soil, compass off by 15 degrees, light at dusk, white, steady, without heat. Sound like low bell carried through water." Teal vanished 3 days later. His vehicle was found on the main road, headlights on, door open. Inside was a folded sheet of county stationery. On it, in his hand, the words, "The ground sings at midnight." His report reached Jefferson City, but was filed without action. The Forestry Department quietly reassigned the region as unsuitable for patrol. By then, the few surviving witnesses of the original 1908 event were elderly. Among them was Mrs. Clara Hoyt, the former sheriff's granddaughter, who lived alone near the river. In a 1949 interview with a traveling folklorist, she repeated what her grandfather had told her as a child. "It wasn't fire that took the church, it was remembrance. The air turned white and forgot how to cool." She paused, then added, "They think it's over, but nothing ever leaves Taney County. It just sinks lower." That recording, faint and crackling, remains one of the last first-hand mentions of St. Matthew's. By 1950, the ridge doe has lost beneath forest growth again, the pale ring hidden under pine needles and years of quiet. But even the new trees grew strangely, twisted slightly toward the center, their bark lighter than any other grove in the Ozarks. Hunters said their dogs whined when passing near, ears pressed flat, tails tucked. That Halloween, a photographer from Kansas City, George Manley, came seeking the truth behind the legend for a magazine feature titled "Ghost Fires of the Midwest." He camped at the edge of the fenced area, setting up his camera on a timed exposure to capture any lights that might appear. His last photograph, recovered weeks later, showed only the ridge bathed in faint fog, except for one strange detail. At the center of the frame stood the faint outline of a steeple, translucent and thin as glass, vanishing halfway up the image. Manley himself was never found. His camera had been placed carefully on its tripod, lens cap off, shutter locked open. The ground beneath it was smooth, dusted with white powder. The caption written on the back of the photograph, in his handwriting, read, "No smoke, no ashes, still waiting." After that, no one spoke of rebuilding, and no further surveys were conducted. The forest remained sealed, its silence unbroken. And yet, each year when October turned cold, the people of Forsyth would still pause just before midnight and listen, waiting for that faint, impossible ringing from somewhere deep beneath the soil. By 1951, Taney County had grown accustomed to keeping its secrets. The war was over, roads were paved, and the valley had the steady hum of radiostatic and tractors. But the forested ridge, the place that once held St. Matthew's Chapel, stayed untouched, fenced off under the name Federal Soil Reserve 14B. Even the county maps drew only blank space there, as if forgetting were policy. That summer, a group of surveyors from the U.S. Geological Service visited to update hydrographic data for the White River Basin. The leader, Dr. Clarence Mott, was known for his skepticism. In a letter to his wife before the expedition, he wrote, "Local men warn of ghosts and bells. I suspect sinkholes and superstition." 3 days later, he wrote again, "The ground here is strange. It sounds alive." Mott's surviving field notes, held today in a sealed box at the State Archive, contain several fragmented observations. Soil density inconsistent with depth. No insects detected in recording zone. Faint luminescence when agitated, not heat, but reflection. The final page reads, Found glassy fragment embedded in loam. Shape of a crossbeam, fused and hollow. Unsure how to remove. 11:58 p.m. Light beneath the roots. He and his 2 assistants never returned. Their tent was found collapsed, food untouched, lanterns cool. A faint ringing was heard by the rescue party as they searched the area, though the direction couldn't be pinpointed. Afterward, federal authorities declared the land restricted. The official statement cited geological instability and risk of subsidence. But locals whispered that the ground had opened again, not a collapse, but a yielding, as if something below had inhaled. By 1953, the story of St. Matthew's had turned into a cautionary tale told at campfires and in dim schoolrooms. The older generation called it the night God folded the church back into his hand. The younger ones, less reverent, called it the white fire. Yet even the skeptics admitted the forest felt wrong. Soundless in summer, lifeless in spring, and colder than the valleys around it. A veteran named Raymond Price, newly returned from Korea, built a small cabin near the old ridge that year. He lasted 6 months. In his final letter to his brother, he wrote, "I can hear bells at night, not loud, not near, but steady. When I try to sleep, I feel the walls breathing with me." His cabin was later found empty, every item in its place except for one, the crucifix above his bed, which had melted at the center, leaving only a hollow outline. The sheriff sealed the property and filed no report. But the following Halloween, travelers on the Forsyth Road swore they saw a glow between the trees, a faint, square shape that hovered for a minute, then disappeared, leaving the scent of lilies on the wind. The county stopped issuing building permits within 3 miles of the ridge after that. No law was passed, but everyone understood why. In the years that followed, Taney County grew modern, yet every map, from the Highway Atlas to the newest soil survey, left the same patch blank. And sometimes, when storms rolled over the Ozarks, lightning would flash across the valley just long enough to show a strange reflection high in the trees, the outline of a roof that was no longer there. By 1955, most who remembered the first night of the church's disappearance were gone. Taney County had settled into its new rhythm. Quiet towns, slow trains, the soft hum of power lines replacing the hymns that once drifted from wooden chapels. Yet in the hills south of Forsyth, the ridge remained unchanged. No building, no pasture, no sound. In early autumn, a journalist from St. Louis named Henry Paxton arrived to write a column for the Missouri Review titled "Forgotten Fires of the Ozarks." He spent 3 nights camped near the old federal fence, recording sounds with a portable reel-to-reel machine. On the first night, his notes mentioned nothing unusual beyond crickets and the low hiss of wind. On the second, strange resonance around midnight. Bell-like, distant, impossible to trace. The third night was his last. The following morning, his car was found on the roadside, headlights still burning, though the battery had long since drained. The recorder sat on the passenger seat, its reel empty but spinning. Inside his notebook were 4 words written in pencil: no smoke, no ashes. Paxton was never found. His tape was sent to the state police, who stored it in evidence for years before misplacing it. The file remains officially unsolved. In 1957, a forestry worker marking new boundaries claimed to hear faint singing in the early dawn. He followed the sound toward the ridge until it stopped abruptly. When he looked down, he realized he was standing at the edge of the pale circle itself, still perfectly smooth, still faintly white after nearly half a century. The scent of lilies hung heavy in the air. That same year, the Taney County Chronicle published a brief anniversary piece, acknowledging the event for the first time in decades. It read simply, 49 years since the St. Matthew's mystery. The ground remains undisturbed. The faithful say the Lord too. Okay. His house whole. The doubters say, the hills remember what man forgot. None go there now. After that, the story fell silent again. New families came and went. The forest grew thicker, the roads straighter. By the late 1950s, the name St. Matthew's Ridge existed only in rumor, and even those who'd heard it as children could no longer find the path. But every Halloween night, when fog curled over the hollows and the wind stilled for just a breath, some swore they saw a faint shimmer among the trees, a thin white glow rising briefly and vanishing, as though a congregation were gathering once more. Sometimes the wind carried a tone, soft and steady, echoing against the hills. And those few who dared to listen said it wasn't mourning. It wasn't warning. It was remembering. Because in Taney County they still say there are fires that leave no smoke, bells that never rust, and prayers that never end, only sink quietly back into the ground.